What's happening, my human controllers? It's me, and I'm here to talk about Animorphs some more. In the interest of keeping the content wheel churning, I've decided to embark on an ambitious mission. I am going to rank all of the Animorphs books from beginning to end. I'm going to read each one, I'm going to review it, and then using Google Sheets formulae and a very scientific ranking system, I'm going to have a definitive list of all of my favorite Animorphs books in order. This video is the first installment in that series. Here's a quick primer on how I'll be reviewing these books. I will be providing a quick summary. I'm going to talk about things that I like, things that I don't like, and then I'm going to grade each book out of 10 on the following criteria. First, plot. How fun is this book to read in a vacuum? Second, significance. How important is this book in the grand Animorphs scheme of things? Third, character. How does this book enhance our understanding of the narrating character or develop their personal story? And fourth, writing. And this one will be more important in the later books. I understand that these are kids' books and we're not expecting Fitzgerald here. This is more about how consistent in tone the books are, and it's going to be important, like I said, when we get to the ghostwritten books. We're going to be weighting the grades as follows. Plot is going to take up 30% of the score, significance and character are each going to take up 25%, and writing is going to take up 20% of the final score. Is this a completely perfect system that will give us an objective quality grade for each book? Yes. With that out of the way, let's talk about The Invasion. This is the first book in the series, and after reading it again for this video, I am prepared to argue that it is the ideal first book. Full spoilers ahead, by the way, but honestly, if you're watching this and you haven't read Animorphs already, what are you doing? Go read Animorphs. They're really good. So book one is the Animorphs origin story, and we're not just dropped into the middle of the story here, we get to witness it all from the beginning. We're introduced to Jake, a teenager in a non-specific American town. He's doing regular kid things at the mall with his best friend Marco. They meet up with Tobias, this loner kid that Jake defended from some bullies once, and they run into Rachel, Jake's cousin, and Cassie, Rachel's best friend and Jake's crush. This is our core group. They decide to walk home through an abandoned construction site where an alien spaceship flies out of the sky and lands in front of them. Out steps a dying alien named Elfangor, an Andalite. And fun fact here, KA actually initially described the Andalites as kind of generic, like, big-headed, slit-eyed beige aliens out of a desire to keep the series budget-friendly for any future TV adaptations. And one of the senior VPs at Scholastic actually criticized the design and said the alien was too cliche, which led to the blue-furred, half-deer, half-man, four-eyed creatures that we've all grown to love, and which also led to this.
Prince Elfangor.
Anyway, Elfangor the Andalite drops out of the sky, and he's injured and he has limited time. And he tells the gang about the Yeerks, these aliens who are invading Earth, parasites who can control people by crawling into their ears and wrapping their slug bodies around the human brains. He gives the Animorphs a tool to fight back, the morphing power. They can touch any animal and acquire its DNA, and then they can turn into that animal at will. And then Visser 3 and the Yeerk forces show up, and the Animorphs flee, and Visser 3 morphs some huge alien monster and eats Elfangor. The next day, Tobias shows up at Jake's house to share that he has morphed his cat, Dude. Jake, incredulous at first, winds up morphing his dog, Homer, and later they meet the rest of the gang at Cassie's house, where Cassie has morphed a horse. A cop shows up and grills them about the construction site, which leads Marco to believe that he may have been a controller, and this cop also knows Tom, Jake's older brother, from a club that he's in called The Sharing. After he leaves, Marco's suspicion opens the debate of whether or not they should join this fight, with this debate going on for more or less the rest of the book. Tobias is strongly in favor, having not much to lose. Rachel is also strongly in favor, and she seems to have been waiting to join a fight like this for her whole life. Cassie loves the idea of morphing, but she doesn't seem as interested in fighting, and Marco is strongly opposed. His mother died last year, and his father's super depressed, and Marco feels like he has more at stake, and he doesn't want to potentially put his father through more loss. Jake, the de facto leader, even this early in the series, is torn between his sense of duty and the knowledge that this fight will not be child's play. Even now, Jake is aware of the responsibility and the guilt that he'll be subjected to if he steps into this role. Later, Tom tries to convince Jake and Marco to join the Sharing, and this causes Marco to suspect that Tom is a Yeerk, and this is enough to convince the rest of the Animorphs to scope out a Sharing meeting. They all attend with Tobias in the air. Jake morphs Dog to spy on the full members meeting a few dunes over, and he overhears Tom stating that he suspects that Jake may have been among the teenagers at the construction site, and that he plans to either infest him or kill him. Jake also sees his vice principal, Mr. Chapman, confirming that they are both controllers, and and as he's spying, Cassie snoops by and she's caught by the same cop from earlier. Afterwards, the gang debriefs and they decide that in light of the cops and Tom being a controller, they have to fight. And Marco agrees, saying that he's in it for Tom and that once they free Tom, he is done. They decide that their next course of action should be to try to find the Yeerk pool and attempt to destroy it. Jake decides to morph a green anole lizard and tail their vice principal around school to see if he can find any clues. And the next day, as Lizard, Jake tells Chapman for all of 5 minutes before learning that there is a Yeerk pool entrance in their school's janitor closet. While they're discussing a plan of action, the Animorphs realize that they don't have any suitable morphs for battle. Marco doesn't actually have a morph at all, so the Animorphs take a trip to the gardens, this sort of amusement park zoo hybrid where Cassie's mom works. And after some hijinks, they leave with Jake having acquired a tiger and Marco a gorilla. We don't find out yet what everyone else has acquired. Prior to meeting up at the school that night, Jake calls each of the Animorphs but learns that Cassie is missing. And the gang meets up at the school anyway, where they see the same policeman and he's dragging Cassie into the school with him. So they follow them down into the Yeerk pool and they are stunned by the size of the complex. This is the first time that they're really coming to terms with the scope of this fight, as well as what's actually at stake as they watch people scream for their freedom from behind these iron bars. The gang morphs and breaks open a few cages before freeing Cassie and trying to fight their way out. And at this point, Visser 3 shows up and he morphs an 8-headed fire-breathing creature. And Tom, human, free will having Tom, his Yeerk is in the pool at the time, attacks Visser 3 and winds up saving the day. Ultimately, the Animorphs escape with their lives and a single free human. And afterwards they meet up with Tobias and they learn that he has stayed in Morph for too long. He's a Nothlit now and he's going to spend the rest of his life as a red-tailed hawk. The book ends with the Animorphs all resolving to fight. So that's the plot. Let's talk about what I love about this book. My favorite part of this book, what stands out most on this rereading as well, is just how well established everything is. As I've done other videos and have deconstructed characters and arcs, I've found myself returning to the invasion every time. And this is because the invasion isn't really a Jake book, even though it's narrated by him. It's an Animorphs book, and the characters all have their core conflicts set up really well in this first installment. Let's run down the list. Tobias. In this book, we learn that he is a bully magnet. We learn that his relationship with Jake is built on Jake defending him. At least it started that way. When the alien ship is landing, the gang's all scared, but Tobias is elated. The promise of a world bigger than his causes him to react with what appears to be just pure joy. He's not remotely afraid of Elfangor. He puts his hand on his shoulder while they're talking, which seems like a small thing, but is kind of a huge deal when you're talking to an alien. He stays behind with Elfangor for a few seconds as Visser 3 arrives as well, planting early seeds for the revelation that we'll have later that Tobias is actually Elfangor's son. Elfangor even hints at his extensive backstory, stating that the Dracon beam will leave no trace of this body, with ellipses, implying that he doesn't necessarily view his Andalite body as his body. He's likely thinking of Lauren and of the years he spent living on Earth as Alan Fangor in this moment. Tobias is also the first one to morph and the most eager of the group to join the fight, and even his foray into roadkill eating that takes place later on is foreshadowed in this book, funnily enough. Cassie. We learn right up front that Cassie is empathetic, natural, and diplomatic. She diffuses conflict in the very first scene that she's in, when Rachel gets angry at the suggestion that they need the boys to walk them home. She's the best morpher. She can control the actual morphing process as well as morphing clothes before the rest of them are able to. Tobias is established as the most naturally open to the idea of aliens and joining the fight, but the morphing ability itself is all Cassie's. More foreshadowing to the way that she ultimately ends the war by sharing that same power. She's established as the Animorphs DNA dealer through her parents' wildlife rehabilitation clinic as well as her mom's job at the gardens. Her empathy is also on full display in this book. She seems to see the morphing ability more as an opportunity to communicate with different species and do good through outreach, which sets us up for some excellent character development when the horrors of war start to take their toll on her. But it also again foreshadows this book's ultimate solution. Cassie does use the morphing power for outreach, and she is right from the beginning. And I have a whole video series that I'm working on that talks a lot about this. Check out The Case for Cassie Part 1 if you haven't already. Marco. Marco is introduced as Jake's best friend. He's a strong character right out of the gate. He is loyal, pragmatic, he's funny, he's smart, and he's written as such. His dialogue still makes me laugh to this day. I reread the books and I laugh, and it might be out of nostalgia, but it might be because he's still funny. I know he was funny when I was a kid, that's for sure. He's opposed to the fight, but not because he's a coward or selfish, because he has a lot at stake. His mother died a year ago. His father's been cripplingly depressed ever since. Marco is all that his father has, and Marco takes that very seriously. He's also the first one to suspect Tom. He's the first one to suspect the cop. And once the gang knows for a fact that Tom's a controller, once it's obvious that Jake is going to be fighting, Marco agrees to join him, but only to save Tom, and this is out of loyalty for Jake. Marco's loyalty for his friend and his knowledge that at the end of the day, he does need to join this fight. He does have some moral obligation here. Trumps his personal feeling that he needs to take care of his father. And I think that's really important, and it's established right here in the very first book. The book also ends with Marco being a valuable and necessary member of the book who has one foot out the door, and he's only fighting conditionally. He needs a bigger reason to fight, and this book sets him up perfectly for the revelation that we receive later that Visser 1 is actually his mother, something which is also foreshadowed in this book through the amount of detail paid to the circumstances surrounding her death. Rachel's main conflict is between her outward appearance and her inner nature, and this book tells us how attractive Rachel is, how well put together and popular, but it also tells us through Jake's perception of her that she always seems like she's been waiting for a greater calling, like the world is boring to her, and this is echoed by other characters in their narration later on in the series. The book also shows us through Rachel's dialogue that her outward appearance definitely doesn't match her inner character. She immediately, as a human, offers to stay with Elfangor to fight Visser 3 at the construction site, and argues in favor of joining the fight against the Yeerks almost as quickly as Tobias does. She also enjoys fighting the most. She picks the biggest morph, and once she's in the heat of the battle, her bloodlust is on full display. So that leaves us with Jake, our moral compass and the de facto leader of the group. His qualities are shown through the story of how he met Tobias and how he attempted to attack Visser 3 as he ate Elfangor. When Jake sees something that is wrong, he cannot sit idly by. He has to act. However, it's also established early on that he takes his friend's feelings into account, and he doesn't lead out of ego or selfishness. The gang elevates him to the rank of leader, and he takes it reluctantly in this book, while simultaneously displaying the same characteristics that will make him succeed in that role and help him develop as a character in future books. Even the characters' relationships to one another are clearly established to a large degree in this first installment. Jake and Cassie's crush on each other is apparent because Jake tells us that he likes her, but it's also characterized through the writing. Marco and Jake are demonstrably best friends, same for Cassie and Rachel. Jake and Tobias have a mutual respect, even if they are entirely different from one another. Tobias goes to Jake the day after the events of the construction site to share his experience morphing dude. Tobias and Rachel's relationship also gets some early seeds planted in this book. She defends him in an early argument, she tells Tobias that she would care if something happened to him, and before they enter the Yeerk pool, Tobias lands on Rachel's shoulder as a hawk, and Jake notices that Rachel leans her head against him a little bit. Tobias and Marco obviously don't get along, and the difference in their sensibilities is stark in this book. Marco's a pragmatist whose actions are guided by logic and reasoning, and Tobias lets his feelings and intuition tell him what he should do. Marco and Rachel's flirty digs at one another are also firmly established in this book. There's some other foreshadowing that I got a chuckle out of as well. Before they acquire their battle morphs at the gardens, there's a lot of sarcastic talk about what they should acquire. Marco jokingly suggests that they should morph fleas, and Rachel tries to visit the dolphins, and Marco and Jake nearly stumble into the rhino cage before saying that they're in the wrong place and leaving. These are all written as jokes, kind of playing up the ridiculousness of these ideas, but these morphs also quickly find their way into the Animorphs arsenal over the next few books, so I can't help but think that KA kind of was making a little joke there. Another thing that I really like is the development of the knowledge that the reader has and how it parallels the knowledge that the Animorphs have. I've noticed that often in literature, especially in science fiction and fantasy, the main character will be kind of a proxy for the reader and will be a mouthpiece for our wonder or our confusion at new ideas. And this is all fine until you reach a point where the character should no longer be experiencing these reactions to the world that they've been written into, but they still are for the benefit of the reader. A great example of this is in Harry Potter. In book 1, Harry finds out about the wizarding world and of course reacts with incredulity. He's lived his whole life as a muggle, and each new piece of magic seems equally unfeasible to him, resulting in him spending a lot of the book in various states of disbelief. This makes him relatable, and it serves to help engage the reader. However, 5 books later, Harry visits the Ministry of Magic, and he's completely flabbergasted when they have to talk to a mannequin to gain entry. And this is just one example. Harry spends 7 books immersed in magic of all types, but his jaw still hits the floor every time he's introduced to something new because JK doesn't understand about character development. Contrast this with the Animorphs. Initially, the Animorphs don't know the scope of the invasion. Jake is floored at each revelation, culminating in their entering the Yeerk pool and being blown away by the sheer horror and scale of it all. But do you know what happens after that? They learn. As the Animorphs learn more facts about the Yeerks, the invasion, the size and scope and scale of the fight they're in, they retain that information and are no longer surprised by it. The characters develop individually, but they also develop as a whole, and they take the reader with them, and as they're exposed to more and more horrors, they become disillusioned with how terrible the war is. It's been a while since I've reread The Invasion, and I'd forgotten just how much the group does develop over the course of these books, but ultimately that's what I love about this book. It's written in such a way that belies how well thought out and planned the series is as a whole. There are very few relics of abandoned ideas here. Instead, there's a bevy of Easter eggs and foreshadowing details for those who care to search for them. With that said, what don't I like about this book? I've actually had the answer to this one for years. Thought-speaking consistencies. When Elfangor meets the gang, he tells them that Visser 3 will be able to hear them if they think at him, and later Jake successfully thought-speaks to Tobias when Jake is in human form and Tobias is Dude, his cat. This is remedied in the 2011 reprints of the books and in subsequent media, but as a kid it always bothered me, and even now I would have loved to see the thought-speak mechanic fleshed out a little bit more in that direction. It would have been an interesting tool to use. It could have led to some fun problems and solutions for the gang. We also never really revisit the idea of thought-speaking feelings and images to one another. This idea was obviously kind of abandoned and just written out for the reprints, and that is unfortunate. I'm also kind of bothered by how fast and loose the Animorphs are with security, morphing tech, their identities in general. They morph openly and in front of a bunch of humans and various types of controller in the final battle at the Yeerk pool. And granted, they hadn't decided to keep their identities secret yet, as Visser 3 hadn't revealed that he believed them to be Andalites, but this seems like common sense that they wouldn't want the Yeerks to know who they are. I mean, they don't want them to know that they were the teenagers who were at the construction site. And you'd also think that one of the controllers who saw them morphing there would go and tell Visser 3 afterwards that no, these aren't Andalite bandits, they definitely are humans because I saw one turn into an elephant right there on the dock. The Yeerks also clearly have a plan to capture the Animorphs prior to the attack at the Yeerk pool, and then they just give it up. They're like very concerned with the teenagers from the construction site. They have a full sharing meeting about how they're gonna find them, and Tom decides he's gonna either turn Jake or kill him just because he suspects him a little bit of having been at the construction site. So after this Yeerk pool battle, did they all just give up on that? Does Tom forget about his suspicion? If anything, this should really turn Visser 3 onto the idea that these may not be Andalites after all. The fact that they're looking for these 5 teenagers that might have been at the construction site, and now a bunch of animals, Earth animals, have shown up at the Yeerk pool like 2 days later. Along these lines, we're also told that the cop controller was the only one who knew about Cassie or planned to make her a controller, but that just makes no sense at all. If that was the case, then why was she online for infestation? Like, who would have crawled into her ear at the end of the Yeerk pool if the only other Yeerk who knew that she was there was inside a cop holding her head into the Yeerk pool? Maybe there are 2 separate lines, like one for old hosts and one for new hosts, and the Yeerks are just super disorganized with tracking whom they've infested and who's in line for what body, who they plan to infest. You know what? Their demonstrable lack of success in spite of the extreme power imbalance between Yeerk and human, this actually isn't too hard to believe. We know that Visser 3 is all bluster and ego at the end of the day, and that he isn't necessarily the sharpest Yeerk in the pool, let alone a good leader in any capacity. His only claim to fame is that he infested Alarin, and it's a recurring theme throughout the book that he's totally incompetent. You know what? I am moving all of these things that I just mentioned into the things I like column. This is just more foreshadowing. I think that it may be legitimately argued that a lot of the plot holes in these books can be chalked up to Visser 3 being wholly incompetent, and I'm going to flesh this idea out some more as we get into this series. Having said all that, let's get to the math part of this video. I am going to give The Invasion a 10 out of 10 for plot. It's a page turner. There is not a point in which you are bored reading this book. No time is wasted. Honestly, it could maybe use a little bit more introspection, but we'll take that out of the character portion. I'm giving it a 10 out of 10 for significance. I mean, I don't need to say much more than that. It's the first book, it's the origin story, and it also packs in more foreshadowing and establishment of who the characters are, how they relate to one another, and the dynamics and growth that we can expect than any first book in a series written for that age, at least, and definitely a lot that are written for older ages. I am going to give the book an 8 out of 10 for character, and this is because it does a really great job in establishing who all of the characters are. Except for Jake, we're kind of left with an incomplete impression of who Jake is. At least I feel that way. If you disagree, you know, yell at me. And finally, I'm giving the writing an 8 out of 10, knocking a few points off for the reasons that I mentioned above. This leaves us with a final score of 9.1, and The Invasion currently sits on top of the list. Thank you all for tuning in, and I will catch you in the next one. Watch out for the controllers. They could be literally anyone.